Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Charlene Sani. Today, our webinar is on mastering the consolidation of digital assets in mergers and acquisitions. This webinar is brought to you by Sitefinity and our premium partner, Smooth Fusion. To start, let's discuss housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar and you will receive a copy after our session. Also, feel free to ask questions at any time through the question panel. Next, we'll move on to meet the speakers. Today's speakers include Dylan Eccles, Vice President of Customer Success at Smooth Fusion, Jonathan Reed, our Principal Solutions Engineer for Sitefinity, and lastly, myself, Charlene Sani, part of the Partner Development Team here at Progress. I'm going to turn it over to Dylan to review the agenda and move on to the main slides. Take it away, Dylan.
Thanks, Charlene. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's meeting. Note, I like to keep things pretty light, so if you do have questions, feel free to shoot them in at any time or anything like that. But as Charlene mentioned, so here's the agenda here. We've got she had already done her agenda. I'd like to walk through a few key definitions for this presentation, as well as acknowledge some challenges and things that customers might experience during mergers and acquisitions, and some of the best practices that we would recommend including in your practices if you're dealing with mergers or acquisitions. And then I'm going to do an introduction to one of our customers, Biamp, and how through the past few years of mergers and acquisitions we've worked with them, as well as Sitefinity to kind of meet their needs. And so firstly, let's talk a little bit about Smooth Fusion. So Smooth Fusion is a Sitefinity partner, and we've been working with Sitefinity since about 2008. We've completed hundreds of web projects using Sitefinity, whether that's support, maintenance, merging, rebuilding, lift and shifts, all kinds of Sitefinity work, and agnostic of industry. So we worked with education, hardware, software, associations, financial institutions. That's the great thing about Sitefinity is it's pretty flexible per industry. But this is just highlighting that we've worked on thousands of Sitefinity projects and for a few hundred customers for over a decade now. And so jump into how we're defining a digital asset. Digital asset is a broad term. And so it's just probably be the most encompassing word or phrase of it. And so whenever you're dealing with websites or a web application or anything on the web, you may consider the entire web application an asset. You may consider the documents an asset. You may consider the content, like the copywriting, functionality, like all of these different kinds of things that exist on one of your websites. And so we're going to use the term kind of loosely because I think the digital asset varies based off of the circumstance you're in, really. Because like I said a second ago, you could be talking about an entire web application, or you could be talking about just individual pieces of content. And I kind of just jumped into this, which is digital assets is a broad term. Digital assets may be content, but it may be an entire web application itself, or all the things along those lines. It could be domain, it could be databases, integrations, and documentation, and all of those things. So it becomes quite robust. And with like multiple software products to store, like this is kind of repeating what I just had already said, which is basically that you might have multiple applications with many features, many pieces of content and things that you need to consider to migrate and merge. And so what we're going to focus on specifically is just digital assets in a couple different capacities. We're going to basically be talking about them all, whether it's pieces of content or whether it's an entire application, unless we're talking about Biamp. And so one thing I think that's very important to point out about mergers and acquisitions, and I'm sure all of y'all, what's on your mind, is that mergers and acquisitions vary every merger and every acquisition is different. And there are very different kinds of mergers and acquisitions, whether it be vertical or horizontal or so on and so forth. And there's a lot of decisions that need to be made. And before you can even do anything in terms of merging your web application, you'll need to basically decide on what is your merger and acquisition strategy that you're engaging in over the next couple of years, and some of the things that might be come to your mind while you're considering the mergers and acquisitions are like costs and the challenges, and how are you going to be able to accommodate the changes and things that are needed. And so we tried to break it down into basically three different buckets to give you all a sense of an idea that of how of things that you may have to consider with the mergers and acquisitions. And some of these things may be unique to industry, but we tried to keep them pretty broad so that they might be applicable to a variety of different industries. So first, we'll talk about brand and marketing real quick. One of the things, and this will get a little bit more clear as we jump into Biamp's case studies, but let's say you're a parent company and you're acquiring another brand. Well, you need to make a decision about how are you going to treat that brand. Is that brand going to become like a product line of your company? Is that brand going to keep its own, what's the word, web presence and leave it as its own website with very minimal branding of your parent brand? Are you going to try to make the color scheme of the website closer, or the assets closer to the parent brand, and things along those lines? And you have to have updated logos, and you have domains that you have to be concerned about. And then if you're taking one website and putting it in and deprecating it and adding that stuff to another website, you need to know how are we going to be migrating this content into the new site. And then along with all of that is the SEO and like metadata when you're making content changes and things like that. It's just, you have to consider quite a bit of granular bits of information. And going into technology, we can talk about like licensing costs. So there's also, in addition to monetary costs, there's opportunity costs with mergers and acquisitions too, as you all know. And this will mostly go into when you're trying to plan on what is going to be your web strategy. Well, you're going to be weighing monetary costs as well as opportunity costs. And so if you're managing if you say you've acquired 4 brands and you have all those 4 brands on 4 different web CMSs, well, then you're having to deal with the management of multiple teams that know how to work with that CMS, as well as knowing how to go in and make constant updates and being able to roll out updates across all of your systems. So it's just about how do you, in such a circumstance where you're trying to change the wheel on a moving car, how do you lessen the opportunity cost in like throughout that entire process? And licensing is one of those things, is analyzing what license of the things that you're acquiring, what are you integrating with? How does it need to be accommodated? Is there a way to unify some of these systems or things so that you can lessen the cost and labor that's necessary to run some of these things? And that ties in with like hosting as well. As if you're unfamiliar, but Sitefinity has like a multi-site version of Sitefinity. And so if you say you have multiple websites and your parent brand is on Sitefinity, well, all the other brands might be on WordPress or some other CMS, but you're wanting a unified management system. So then you might merge those sites into your multi-site instance so that you can share not just themes or like color schemes and styles, but you can also share functionality and documentation. So you're not having to recreate things, as well as having consistent experience across all your brands. And I can keep driving down into more of these, but it's just that you all probably understand that the more systems you have, the more touch points there are, the more things you have to know, and the more you have to maintain. And so the idea is, through the merger and acquisition process, how do you unify and slim down your systems to what is essential without losing like your web presence or taking hits to online and things like that. So I know that's all this talk. And it kind of, to operational, it kind of ties in with technology as well as brand and marketing. It's just like I was saying with opportunity cost, is you're having to manage multiple brands in different places. You're having to roll out updates to multiple systems and things along those lines. And so you typically are wanting to identify how do we create future-proof ourselves essentially, so that you're not having to deal with technical debt or things along those lines. So we'll jump into some best practices, and again, to tie back to what I said a second ago, which is that almost every merger and acquisition is different from the other ones. So there's always different things to consider, but we've tried to come up with some just general rules of thumb that you could use whenever you're dealing with these situations so that you can assess what you're dealing with as well as identify how to move forward and keep all of your stakeholders happy at the same time. So number one is due diligence, establishing your website growth strategy that is in line with your organization's merger and acquisition strategy. So firstly, you need to know what is going to be happening with your company as well as the companies it's merging or acquiring with. Like, what is that strategy? It might be, like I said a second ago, you might be acquiring a brand that will become a product family. Maybe it'll continue existing as its own brand. Well, you need to know that information before you can start to make changes to your web applications to accommodate those kinds of things. And so let's say, and this might be a little more clear as I jump into Biamp's case study, but the first, once let's say that we have decided on our M&A strategy and we know that we're going to be the parent site is the Sitefinity website, and we're going to eventually want to get all of these brands, informations, and things into this parent site in Sitefinity. Before you can start the migration process, you need to essentially audit, well, what can my website do right now? How was it built? Is it monolithic and locked down? Do I have access to migrate content? Yada, yada, yada. So really, you just need to identify what is it going to take to accommodate some of these changes over the next year or 2 years. And two, is our system capable of doing that? If not, how do we get to the next point to enable that? And that's where you begin reforming and preparing your CMS to accommodate incoming assets. And again, this might get a little more easier as I start giving you examples, because assets may vary from industry to industry. Maybe you offer services, maybe you offer products, maybe you offer consult. Like, there's so many different things that you have to consider. And with Biamp, I'll just get to that real quick, is that they're a hardware and software company. And so for them specifically is they were acquiring these different brands that all had products, and they needed to quickly migrate hundreds of products into their website. And so what we did there, and again, I'll just kind of segue into the next slide, is we did an audit of their current system. We took a look at the products and stuff that they need to be brought in, compared the schema to what they have today, and just sort of analyzed, okay, how do we make sure that this can accommodate what you need in a few months? And so it's not just like the features and configurations and things, but also, are you able to edit your pages to the degree that you need to? And this is kind of overlapping into best practices of Sitefinity, which I won't get too far into details. But let's get into the Biamp case study and start painting a picture. So Biamp, I won't read all of this for you, but Biamp is an audio-visual hardware and software company. So they sell both hardware products as well as software products that go along with, like, auditoriums or stadiums, conference rooms, anything along those lines. And they came to us in about 2016. Just a little backstory is their site was built, the current site that they have now was built by someone else. And they came to us because much of it was hard coded. They had monolithic widgets where they couldn't change titles on pages or widgets, and they couldn't add products that they needed to without developer intervention. That's just not how we like to run websites. We like to empower our customers to be able to manage all of the content and things from the CMSs. And so our first task at hand was, how do we break open this website to allow the customer to manage the content and things that they want? And this was even before the merger and acquisition. But then, in just a matter of months after that conversation happened and we started breaking open their site, we got news that they were acquired by a firm called Highlander Partners. And they were acquired by Highlander Partners with the specific intention to scale aggressively. And so their goal, and all of this is public information, so I'm not afraid to share it, is their goal was to acquire essentially 2 companies a year since 2017. And they've since done some more than that in each year and some less based on the pandemic and stuff like that. But so they were acquired. A new CEO who specializes in acquisitions and mergers was brought on to help guide that future. And so pretty soon after that, I got a call from our customer, and he said, "Hey, how quickly can our website accommodate 500 new products?" And so that was it. And I mean, obviously, you don't exactly know immediately. It comes down to doing a research and discovery phase about what is going to need to be accommodated and brought over. Um, and so for the much of the first few years or so, I'll get into some of the challenges. So sorry, I also digress a lot. One note is as we get into these, the way that we decided to break down this sort of quote unquote case study of Biamp is to focus on three specific challenges that they dealt with acquisitions and mergers, rather than try to cover all of the bases of acquisitions and mergers. And I assume that maybe some of y'all might have specific questions about scenarios and things that y'all are dealing with, and we could talk about those at the end of the call or something. But I wanted to paint a picture of what are the challenges that Biamp dealt with during the acquisitions and merger, and then how did we proceed through those using Sitefinity specifically. So they were acquired. Cambridge Sound Management was one of their first acquisitions. That site, I believe, is still standing as is. But but through this time period, as I mentioned, it was basically preparing, auditing the environment to identify, well, how can the site support the things that they need? Because what sites are all logic and condition. So in order for it to code, obviously, but so whatever you're going to be feeding in, you want it to support, it has to be logical. And so that's why it's so important to put a lot of emphasis on planning and research and things along those lines. And so we spent like several months going through their website, breaking widgets open so that they could edit them on the fly, create landing pages, created them a bunch of modular widgets and things like that, so they could create these new marketing pages on the fly for these brands and these acquisitions and stuff like that. So that was really the phase one, was auditing the system. And as I mentioned, I kind of covered some of this stuff just a second ago, which is when they came to us, they had monolithic widgets. And what I mean by that is like a single widget that comprises your entire page so that you can't go in and edit individual components of it. And so that was basically, that disallowed them from being able to create their marketing pages and things on the fly. And same with their navigation was hard coded. And so we had to edit that. And so really like the first step was just making sure that their environment could accommodate it. And luckily with Sitefinity being so robust and customizable, we were able to crack that stuff open and get them in a place where they could edit content on a daily basis and add content without needing a developer. So that was our number one goal, was how do we get them to a place where they don't need us every day so they can run their business. And that was really setting it up for challenge two. So challenge two, this again is just a specific example. So CrowdMics was a company at one point in time of its own. They had acquired CrowdMics. And since CrowdMics had a fairly strong, I guess, web presence among its customer base, they didn't want to lose CrowdMics.com immediately. But they did want to incorporate it into the Biamp product catalog in a sense, and associate the product with Biamp so that they could add conferences. There's not any confusion around branding or anything along those lines. And so the first thing we did with this one was we actually built a second site on the Sitefinity instance in the multi-site for the CrowdMics website. And so this was a few pages long, and it just featured the product as well as a bunch of product information. But one of the key things that made it quite easy was that the multi-site was built. It's a multi-site, so it's a second site on the same instance of Sitefinity, and we were able to leverage like existing page templates, existing widgets, sharing libraries, images, and all of these things across the site. So you're not starting from scratch. And so the two comforting things about that are that, one, we know the branding is already there and we don't have to go back and customize it or recreate it or anything along those lines. So they basically have a starter kit for a new website. And then I already forgot what my second point was. But I was going to say that, it was, just not having to rewrite all of the content, recreate all of the content, and they could just leverage the existing stuff was a huge win for them. And then basically being able to spin up sites on demand if needed to for certain products and things along those lines. So this is just an example, like as I was trying to get to with the mergers and acquisitions, like at a high level, is that there are so many different kinds, and it may vary from brand to brand on how you're treating them. Because there are, I think that's a good segue to the next slide actually with CrowdMics. So this is a product that was its own website, became its own website under a product Biamp brand. And then as of today, actually, it's been migrated fully into the Biamp product catalog. So if you go to Biamp products, you'll see crowd mics, the same as all of their other products. So it was just like a phased approach to incorporating it into their backlog without compromising brand identity on the web or elsewhere with existing customers. So it's more of like a soft transition. Um, Another company that they had acquired, which is Neats.io, up here a little bit. So Neats.io was an existing, so CrowdMics was a product company. They had one product, essentially one or two products that worked together. And so they're a very small site focused specifically on these two things. Well, Neats.io was essentially like a competitor of sorts with Biamp. And so they had acquired them. But with the acquisition, they decided that Neats would become a product family immediately rather than continuing to live on as its own website. And so with that, what we had to do is consider, okay, so they've got this website that does not live on Sitefinity. It's a few hundred pages long, 300 or 400 pages of the site. It's got 400 products or something like that. And they've got these images, they've got documents, they've got firmware, and they've got other software that needs to be added to Biamp.com. And so really the initial step was assessing what is all that needs to be brought over to the application. Is there anything that can just y'all don't care about that could be deprecated? And so with this one, what I really wanted to point out was, as everybody know, I think the biggest feat, whenever you're like, okay, this site's being deprecated, I need to merge it into this one, is what happens to all of your domains. And since we had already at this point broken open the product module for Biamp, there was no need for us to extend that functionality any further. And so it's like all of your steps sort of build on each other over time to make future acquisitions and mergers easier. And so when we got to this point within Biamp, what we did, biggest question was, okay, we've got 300 or 400 URLs that we need to redirect to Biamp.com. I don't want to go through, and I can go and drop those into the web config, but we're also going to have situations in the future where we're acquiring other brands and we need to incorporate those too. So it makes no sense, again, to speak back to developer intervention. We like to enable our customers as much as possible or empower them. And so when we were thinking about this problem that, well, in a few weeks from now, they're going to perhaps buy another brand and need to do the exact same thing. So we came up with a solution that allowed them to do that stuff with very minimal intervention from us. And so we've got the customer trained on how do you migrate images, how do you populate products, and yada, 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 all of those things. So there wasn't much training on that. But the new feature was the URL redirect. So essentially what we did is we created a redirect module within their CMS, and it allows them to import. It has essentially 3 columns, and you can see an example here, just like this is a screenshot from the back end of Sitefinity. They've got the page title, you have the old URL, and you have the new URL. So we do put rewrite rules for the parent level domain within the config, but what this allows them to do is they can actually export. What they did is they exported a list of URLs from the current website into an Excel sheet. Then they went through that Excel sheet and mapped it to pages on their current website on the Biamp.com, and then they imported it and automatically created there's 600 redirects in here now of pages, just of deprecated websites that are now pointed to pages on Biamp.com, so that they can easily manage their domains and not lose track of them. Because that was quite a big thing with the website deprecations, not losing SEO and people being like, well, what happened to this company? It just disappeared. And so this method was one of the things that we had done to accommodate that. And then we'll go straight into the Q&A, I guess. But really, what I was trying to summarize it all back together, I know I gave very few examples how we work with them on mergers and acquisitions, but I wanted to point out just that there is quite a bit of variance in mergers and acquisitions, and what you need to do may vary depending on what kind of acquisition or merger you're dealing with. But I think some of the core things are the same, which is identifying what is the system you want. If you're wanting to merge all your stuff into a single system, which system is that? Can that system accommodate those things? If not, what does it need to get there? And so on and so forth. And then over time, it's just about making your future easier and making sure that your site can accommodate those things that you're going to be needing to do over the years of your market applications.
Great.
So,
Q&A. Well, thank you, Dylan. This is super helpful for any company that's going through mergers and acquisitions. I know for App Progress, we are no stranger to acquisitions, and our web team is a major asset with our own acquisition. So I think this is helpful. Moving on to Q&A. I do see a couple questions, but feel free for anybody who hasn't put questions in the Q&A, please feel free to do so, or the chat, either one. Our first question that we received in, we are going through acquisitions. How do you determine which site to keep and which to depreciate?
that actually came up in a conversation yesterday. That goes back to, again, what is the company's merger and acquisition strategy? Does one of those brands have much more visibility than others? Is it much more concrete? Is it much more mature? That's kind of how Biamp did it. Like the intention was Biamp was acquired with the intent of making Biamp this sort of global audio and visual company. And so with that goal in mind, that's what we started at. And so there may even be technological reasons you pick one site over the other, but with CMSs like Sitefinity and having multi-site, you can always, like, let's say you have a preference for one of your websites because you like the CMS or the way it's set up or the configuration. There shouldn't be a reason why you can't use that as your host for all of your websites, essentially. And so it really comes down to, I guess, brand identity and which one is it that you're trying to have all the credibility go to, or do you have a system that you're trying to expand and you want to build on top of that?
Yeah.
For Biamp, it was they wanted to spread on Sitefinity and they wanted to spread with Biamp.
Yeah. And that goes into the next question. How does your team adopt the new CMS platform during an acquisition?
Quite a bit of training. I mean, so with Smooth Fusion, I would say that we're highly specialized in Sitefinity CMS, and we do have other enterprise application work. But so I mean, with the training stuff, there's usually a bit of phases of training. It's just kind of built into the plan, and most of the time, with my experience with our customers, and that have been doing mergers and acquisitions, is that our point of contact that who's managing the parent brand website typically still play a key role in like how to handle the rest of the websites that they're acquiring and things like that. And so it's been quite a collaborative process with me and the customer and understanding. Like, he got a new boss, I had to teach them about how the website was working. But then he got a new developer to work with him on his team, so I needed to get him familiar with the website application and how are things built. And so it comes down to the role, I would guess, but it's usually built into the plans.
Yeah. And
Yeah. Hey,
process.
yeah, I was gonna say, hey, Dylan, obviously thank you for being a trusted Sitefinity partner. And part of one of our well-acknowledged opportunities with Sitefinity is how easy it is to use. So hopefully if you are using Sitefinity or other CMSs, it's pretty intuitive as you bring in those new web properties or brands or systems, and the team is obviously looking at that from a view of, where the changes really are. So
Great. Thank you both. Let's see the next question. What are your suggestions for migrating content from one site to another? Our list keeps growing.
Yeah, that is a fun one. It's also is dependent on what CMS. So if all of your websites are on Sitefinity CMS, one thing that we've done historically is upgrade. Like, if you have Site Sync on your license, what we'll do is we'll take one Sitefinity site, upgrade it to the whatever version of the target site we're trying to get to, and we will site sync over the content and things that we need from there. If it's coming from a different CMS, it's a much more manual process of identifying and documenting the content that needs to come over. And quite often there might be like a second agency that is helping with like content strategy and helping consolidate that. Our team is mostly focused on the technical side of it. But we would typically recommend having either someone in-house or finding a content strategy partner that can help you manage, like, how are you going to merge all this content together? Because that'll be the first thing. It's like some of it obsolete. Is it all necessary? Yada, yada, yada. But if it's all on Sitefinity, there's programmatic solutions. If it's not on Sitefinity, there's bulk and import and export operations of certain kinds of content and things like that. But I unfortunately, there is quite a bit of manual intervention that does have to happen sometimes.
Okay. Jonathan, is there anything you'd add there?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say it's obviously a common question as we go through, customers looking at Sitefinity for the first time, or for customers who've been on Sitefinity for some period of time. Is how do I bring content over? Obviously, with trusted partners like, Dylan, we look at the API, we look at the CMS that you may be coming from. Typically, most of them have some type of export utility or their own APIs that you can interact with, especially around things like structured content and information that can be done automated. There's always then the process of checking page creation. Does it look right? Is it created correctly? Those types of things. As noted, manual intervention is always a thing. Progress does also offer other products to make testing easy, like Test Studio, but there is human intervention always involved.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's get on to the next question. What CEO risk factors are there? So I use a domain or a subdomain or a subfolder.
Sorry, you may have broken up slightly. What was you repeat that?
Okay. Well, kind of a two-part question. So let's start with the first part. What CEO risk SEO? What SEO risk factors are there?
Okay. Yeah. Anytime that there's a change in domain and stuff like that, you'll always take a hit. Usually if you're deprecating pages and things like that, but there's systems for like 301 redirects where you're giving the credibility of an existing page to another page, or like canonical URLs and stuff like that. So there's ways to go about minimizing the impact of it, of this domain changes and things like that. But you'll always have some fluctuation. But it's not like you'll lose it forever, because these crawlers are happening mostly every, I don't know the timeline, but you can force it to happen too.
Yeah.
So that's again is I would say is we try to leverage some SEO partners. I mean, we know how from our angle, from a technical side, what tools are there to be able to allow you to minimize your domain, but in terms of deciding like your SEO impact, but it kind of comes down to what you're trying to do. But if you're changing domains, there's redirection rules that you can put into place to help minimize that impact.
Okay. If the second question is I use a domain or subdomain or subfolder. How does it work there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's business strategy involved. As you're making a change for your new acquisition, looking at the clout that particular brand brings to the table may help you identify, do you keep their current domain? Definitely something that Sitefinity can facilitate. Should it be a subdomain of your parent company? Should it be some type of subfolder? I think the question is kind of, what do we do about this? Well, the good news is Sitefinity and its multi-site capabilities allow you to set up any of these types of configurations. So subdomain, top level domain, or subfolder type structures. So, with redirect tools, things like that, you could obviously do subdomains or subfolders, or you can keep it as the same domain, but just bring over those assets to Sitefinity and have a central management system with our multi-site management features.
I think that's it for questions. Anything else you'd like to add, either of you?
I don't have anything. I mean, My last bit of advice is it's very frustrating. It can be a very frustrating, very exhausting process because there's so much to consider. But I do recommend anytime you come across potential problems or you see it potential problems, note all of that stuff down, because when it all comes together, you'll be surprised at how much impact forgotten things can have on the total, if that makes any sense, the totality of it all. Some things seem small, some things don't, but it's just really good to just be comprehensive when you're approaching something like this as early on as you can be. That'll make your life easier in the future.
Great. Makes total sense. Oh, great. Well, thank you all for joining today's webinar, and we will follow up with a recording in a couple days. And feel free to share with your teammates, and hopefully we'll see you at the next partner webinar on Sitefinity Insights in November. Goodbye, everybody.